Okay, welcome everyone to this evening's information Q&A, but also prayer time as we look toward the elections this week. And so thank you for coming, and for those who may engage in the video online, welcome, and I hope you're able to be part of this when you do join. And so we are going to be recording, and so I know it might seem a bit much to have the mics on when in this case, but I'd like us to record it and then be able to have others engage with it later. I want to just open in prayer, and then I'm going to invite Grant to come forward and to share what he has prepared, and then there'll be an opportunity for some questions afterwards. And then we'll pray together. So let's pray now. Lord, we give you thanks for this opportunity to gather together as we anticipate and as we look forward to this week and being able to participate in the elections. And as we give that consideration tonight, we thank you for Grant. We thank you for his preparation. We thank you that we have the opportunity to engage in conversation with both him and with each other and with you. And so, Lord, would you be glorified, guide our thoughts, guide our discussion, and lead us in the way that you would like us to go, and having hope, but also giving hope to others that we may enter into conversation with. And so we give you thanks for this time together. Amen. All right. So thank you, Grant. I don't know, many of us know Grant, many of us, and I think those who were here last time, I gave a deep introduction, and Grant said, I didn't expect you to share with us all of that information. So I'll try and keep it a little bit more succinct, but I've got to try to find it. Because it was a while ago that you had sent sort of the resume to me. So Grant has spent more than 20 years in various forms observing elections around Africa and researching and supporting democratic elections. And so he began in 2004, and so this was 20 years this year that he's been in that environment. And so he has a lot of knowledge historically, but also a lot of knowledge in his own research and his own interest in the elections. He has been throughout the last couple of years giving interviews with ENCA and various other news agencies about the elections and giving his opinion, what it means, and so he comes with a wealth of information. And we're blessed that you're able to share that with us. And he's also gone out this year in his own business called Get Metrics, and that is sort of coming up. And they've just got the website that is launched, getmetrics.co.za, so you can have a look at that. Mary's going, don't look at the spelling mistakes. It's an exciting journey for him and for Mary, the family, and those who are participating in that. And so bless you and welcome, and thank you for sharing with us. So please come forward.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, everyone, for coming. This is the third thing I've done with my voice today, so I'm trying to protect my voice now. But welcome on a chilly Sunday night to those of you who are getting the live feed in the audience. You have you're getting the sneak preview, and then I guess anyone else who wants to watch it when Ian is able to do his Google Foo and put it on the internet, that'll be great. Okay, I don't want to speak about the same things that I spoke about a couple of weeks ago on the Thursday night, because a lot of people said that they did watch it online. So I wanted to talk about some of the other interesting things that you just don't have time to talk about. Elections cover a vast range of areas and topics. So I've picked three that I think are quite interesting as we come up to Election Day. And of course, the focus tonight also turns a little bit more towards how should we respond, or how can we respond as Christians? Obviously, I don't think there's one way to respond to an election as a Christian, but how might we respond? And I have some thoughts on that as well. So tonight is going to be possibly less political and maybe a little bit more about that nexus between national politics and our faith as well. So I think it's an appropriate venue to do that, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. So tonight I wanted to talk about these three topics, and it was advertised in the little flyer that was sent out. So the first is why voter turnout matters. We hear a lot about that. You will hear many different people on election day. There will be a lot of reports of low voter turnout here, high voter turnout there. Why do we worry about voter turnout? Why is it so important? And I'll show you one particular graphic that I think even though I know it, every time I look at it, I go, gosh, can't believe that graphic. It's quite amazing. Then the second one is a more philosophical one. Why is it that we often feel let down by our political leaders, by political parties, even the party that we decide to cast our vote for? Why is it that we often feel so let down? I mean, I think if you do any kind of opinion poll in most democracies, politicians are the least trusted individuals of any group. Maybe car mechanics are slightly less trusted than political parties, but it's always touch and go between those two groups. And so, we don't trust them, but we vote for them, and we actually give them a huge amount of power in our lives. And I have some philosophical thoughts on why it is we often feel let down by our political parties. And then I also think it's valuable at a moment like this to put the elections into context, because there are a lot of people who are saying this is do or die, make or break. I heard that John Steenhuisen was finishing up the DA rally earlier today, and in the excerpts of the speech I was listening to on the radio, he said, this is the most significant moment in 30 years of South Africa's democracy. Right? So clearly John Steenhuisen and maybe the colleagues in the DA think that this right here is a big moment. And I want to put that in perspective. I think it's important to put some of this into perspective. All right, voter turnout. What is it? There's various ways to understand voter turnout and to think about it, and each of those tells us something different. Okay, so there are different ways in which we talk about what voter turnout is, but the figures that you will see on election day are typically the number of people who voted who were registered voters. So you might see that a figure of, let's say, voter turnout was 66%, like it was in the last elections in 2019. And that is typically comparing the number of people who did vote on election day with the number of people who bothered to register. But as we know, not everyone who is eligible to register does register. And this is actually a different metric, which is called voting age population. So there is the voter turnout of registered voters, which is typically the figure that we hear. But then there is another figure which is less often talked about, but is just as significant, if not more, and that figure is how many adult South Africans eligible to vote are there in South Africa, and what does the number of people as a percentage of that look like? And I'm going to show you that in a minute, and I think it's quite important. So if we look at the screen, and of course I'm using my magic pointer, so when this is on video later, unfortunately it won't show, but anyway, I'm pointing at the figures up on the screen here. What you see is that in the last elections in 2019, in say, Mpumalanga province, the registered voters was 1.9 million, but there are an estimated, we don't actually know because it's very difficult to sit and count 3 million people, but we estimate that in Mpumalanga there's about 3,200,000 eligible voters, right? Not all of those people registered to vote. You can subtract the registered voters, the 1.9 from the 3.2, and you can work out how many people in Mpumalanga as a province did not bother to register. And similarly, you can go down and you can look Gauteng is particularly significant. If you look, there's 6.1 million registered voters and probably nearly 12 million eligible voters in Gauteng. So these are the breakdowns according to estimates in 2019. These figures will be different this year. We'll probably be able to get some figures on that later. Now, when you actually look at the implications from a numerical point of view, the significance of what this absence of voters means is going to become clearer. I often ask myself this question: why is it that it's so hard to find a die-hard ANC supporter? There's supposed to be 1 in 2 people, right? More than 1 in 2 people are supposed to love the ANC, but try and find someone who says, yes, ANC Viva, okay? And I think, well, maybe I'm living in the wrong neighborhood. Maybe I'm living in a neighborhood where I need to find a die-hard DA supporter. And I look around and it's very hard to find a die-hard DA supporter. Well, there's a reason for this. And that's because actually the most likely person you are going to find anywhere in any neighborhood is someone who hasn't bothered to register to vote. Statistically, in 2019, that is now the most likely person that you will meet. And it has some concerning implications. Now, these are the actual figures from 2019. The valid votes, which is the total number of votes cast minus spoilt ballots. Spoilt ballots are ballots which, for one or the other reason, the intention of the voter is not clear, or the person has deliberately spoilt their ballot. Those ballots, the 235,472 spoilt ballots, were removed. And then we calculate who goes to Parliament, who are our elected MPs, from that figure of 17,437,000. For the purposes of the 2019 elections, 17,437,000 was 100% of the votes that counted. It was 100% of the votes that counted. But 17 million was only 66% of the registered voters, which was 26,700,000. And when we look at the voting age population, based on the 2018 estimate, it was 35 million. So when you put that 17 million into 35 million, if you're good at maths like Pete is, we know Pete's very good at maths, then you can work it out. It's 48.61%. Pete can tell us to the 7th decimal, but we won't make him do that. The reality is that of all adult South Africans in the country, less than half had their vote counted. Less than half. Now, the ANC didn't win 100% of those 17 million. They actually won much closer to 50%. So let's look at what it means for these three parties, the biggest three parties, the ANC, the DA, and the EFF. In reality, because of the low voter turnout, and because we calculated the results on 17 million seats, the ANC's 10 million votes got them, 57.5%. Right? And then the DA got 3 million, which equates to 20%, 20.7%, and the EFF got 10.8%, based on 1.882 million votes. If we calculate what the ANC's popularity amongst all adult South Africans was, now, I mean, I have to put an asterisk here and say that there may be some people who didn't bother to vote, who may actually like the ANC and may support the ANC, that's always possible, but they didn't vote, so we don't know what their intention was. If we discount all of those votes of people who didn't bother to register, then the ANC is a majority government where only 27.9% of adults support it. So in South Africa, what we know is, as of 2019, 27.9% of adult voters support the ANC. That's what we know. That's all we know. And yet that 27.9% of adult voters is enough because so many people do not vote for them to get a majority of seats in Parliament. When you look at the DA, the same picture emerges. Rather than the 20% that the DA got, they would only get 10% of the total population of adult voters. And similarly for the EFF, instead of 10.8, they would get 5.2. All right, so it's, I think, quite an astonishing difference. And you imagine if we had 100% of people turning out to vote, what might our national parliament look like? It would probably look fairly different, just based on those numbers as we show them. And here's the graphic that I'm not going to flick to it yet, but the graphic that I'm going to show you now shows exactly what I've just shown you in numbers, but it shows to you visually. So this is what the political support for parties looks like in South Africa. Those green persons out of 100, this is 100 persons representing 100% of South Africans eligible to vote. Those green persons there are ANC voters, the blue are DA, the red are EFF, and the remainder are the other parties. And then the white voters didn't bother to register or didn't bother to vote. So by far, the most significant voting bloc in the 2019 elections did nothing. Nothing at all. It's why there is such an obsession, not just in South Africa, but globally in electoral democracies, with encouraging better voter turnout. 66% doesn't sound too bad. 66% voter turnout. It's lower than most mature democracies. 70 is considered a baseline, 75 is healthy, 80 is good. So 66% is on the low side, but it's not the worst. There's been elections with 40, 35% voter turnout, depending. But it's 66% of the people who bothered to register. What we also know is that of the people who do not register, the vast majority of them are young people. The vast majority of people who do not bother to register to vote are in the 18 to 30 age group. And there are a lot of implications of who our national government is that affect the 18 to 30 age group in particular. Guys, I'm looking at you. I'm so glad you came this time. But I mean, you guys, this will be your first election. And I hope you're going to vote, because who you vote for is going to have a significant impact on your futures. One of the really sad statistics that come out recently has been the exceptionally high levels of unemployment, but those levels of unemployment look catastrophic when you look at a national picture. They look cataclysmic, even worse, when you look at people between the ages of 18 and 30. Between the ages of 18 and 30, if you are a young black person in South Africa, only 2 out of 10 are finding any kind of employment. That is astonishing. And yet, the government that is making policies that are leading to that situation is, in fact, being allowed to be re-elected with a pretty good majority, all things considered, predominantly because no other political parties in the system can attract and galvanize support from the young people. About 3 years ago, I went up to Zambia to observe the elections in Zambia, and that was a very, very interesting election, because in Zambia, the incumbent was expected to win, and in most African countries, the incumbent, the person who is currently in power, had pulled out all the stops to win. He had deployed the state, he had deployed the police, he had made all sorts of threats, he had throttled the opposition, he had done everything he could to win. And when it came to the elections, he was defeated in a very unusual way in Africa. he was defeated. He got the same number of votes as he got in the previous election. But this time it wasn't enough for him to win the election. In fact, he lost by quite a considerable margin. And what was the difference maker between him having those votes and winning and having those votes and losing by quite a large majority? It was that his opponent got the youth vote. Suddenly, over 600,000 young people got up off their couches and they went and bothered to vote. And they changed the regime like that. In South Africa, that power exists in the hands of young people today. If all of the young people, and Ross, you can carry this message back to your young people if you want to, but if the young people rose up and bothered to go and vote and told us what they think about everything, whatever they tell us, that's what the picture would be in South Africa, because they have the numbers. So voter turnout and by extension, the absence of the youth vote is continuing to shape our politics. So if you wonder why politics looks like a bunch of old people, there's a reason why. Because the young people are not voting. The only ones who are voting are over the age of 30 and getting older every year. Okay, that's point number one. And so I've made the point, so I'm going to move on from what's the point and talk number two. Why is it that we often feel let down by political parties? As I said, this is a more philosophical point and less numbers. So let's get into it. Generally speaking, what voters want is relatively predictable. It's relatively understood. We know what voters want, and here are a laundry list of some of the things that they want: a better life, dignity, jobs, safety and security, government services, low taxes, social reforms, protection against exploitation. You can add others to the list. But it's very clear what a voter expects from their government, right? We have to pay taxes. We don't have a choice about that. And the exchange between our agreeing to pay taxes is that the government then allows us to represent who gets to decide how those taxes are spent. That's the bargain, right? It's immediately broken the moment that we elect people into power, because they decide in their own interest, not in the voters' interest, which partly leads to the disillusionment. But this is a very predictable and very constant list of what a voter actually wants. It doesn't really change from election to election. And chances are, if I come back in 5 years and Ian lets me talk again, we're 50-50 on that at the moment, but it's gone down, okay, all right? The polls are not looking good. In that case, the chances are I could use this slide again and nothing would change, right? Because it's not likely that people are going to want a different shopping list. Maybe something rises on the list, maybe something falls on the list, but these are generally what voters want. But what do political parties want? Well, the serious political parties, that's very simple for them to answer. They want power. That's what the serious political parties want. They want power. And the way in which they get that power in a democracy is through the ballot. So the political party wants power. They have to go through the ballot. So they refer back to the laundry list. And so what they do is they start to talk to us about our aspirations, about our hopes. And they make all of the promises that I discussed in my last lecture about, the manifestos that they do. So the political parties focus very much on telling us what we want to hear. As human beings, we are inclined to like it when someone tells us what we want to hear. Even though someone knows that you're lying to them, if you tell the lie in the right way, they really want to believe you. And unfortunately, this is something that political parties play to very, very effectively in the way in which they message their campaigns, they message their manifestos. They have teams of marketing whizzes who come along, and they're able to package their promises and their offerings to us in ways that, even though we know deep down they're not going to deliver on these things, but we like the dream. We like the idea that it might be the case. And so we are part of our own self-delusion sometimes, believing that these promises that are made might come true. We're just going to vote and see and hope. Maybe this time it will be different. And so campaign messaging is basically just a bunch of blank boards where what they do is they figure out, the marketing people in the political parties figure out what are the messages that are going to be the most well received by the voter. And of course, there are different approaches that you can take. You can tell a very good positive story, or you can tell a very negative story about someone else who you're trying to persuade them not to vote for. But the essential idea here is that political parties approach elections about messaging. They do not actually, the manifestos I showed you last time, they do not actually put machinery behind those manifestos. If you're going to be quite serious about putting your manifesto into action, then you're going to start already thinking about which people might I appoint if we're successful to win these elections. Which people am I going to appoint as leaders, as persons in the Ministry of Finance, or the Ministry of Agriculture, or the Ministry of Safety and Security? But political parties are not doing that. They are selling you the dream, and if they are elected into power, then they scramble around trying to figure out, okay, now what do? We got power. Maybe we weren't even expecting it. This was exactly the case in Zambia. Ironically, the party that won and the presidential candidate that won on the back of the youth vote, his party was not prepared for power. They were not prepared to win. And so when they won, that's the day zero, that they began planning. We've got the power, now what do we do with it? So there's a complete disconnect between what the parties tell you and what they're planning to do. Right now, I know from several of the parties, what they're actually planning for after the elections is how to negotiate a favorable coalition arrangement. That is the actual primary strategic plan in many political parties right now, because that's their primary focus, because it comes back to their ultimate goal. And this is why so often, even when we vote for the party we like, even if that party gets into power, we very often feel so disillusioned at the end of the day, because there was so much premium on the dream and on the marketing, and so little effort on the part of the parties to actually make it a reality. Let me bring in an interesting aside here. I've always found this, as a political scientist, I've always found this passage in Samuel very, very interesting. I have to step a bit close to read it, but I'm going to read it out loud here. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and he will make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest. Still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." And the story in Samuel goes on. The people of Israel had gotten tired of having prophets guide them. They wanted a king. They looked around at all of the other nations who had kings, and they said, "This is what we're missing. We need a king." And so they demanded of Samuel, "We want a king." And Samuel warned them. Be careful what you wish for. And then he got tired of the Israelites complaining and moaning to him, so then he took their complaints to God. And God said, this is a bad idea, but let's give them what they want. And I think Ian said this morning, if you were paying attention in the sermon, if you were here, Ian already made the point that of the very first 3 kings that Israel had, didn't go too well. Straight off the bat, it didn't end up well, and pretty much exactly what was promised by God through Samuel to the Israelites is exactly what they got here. So I think it's a difficult one for someone to motivate themselves to get up and go and vote when they have this feeling of disillusionment. What's the point? It's really not going to make much difference anyway. Whichever of these guys ends up in Parliament, they're going to be out for themselves. So what is the point? Well, let me get to part number 3. And hopefully this is a slightly more hopeful point. The second point's a bit depressing, but it's a reality. South Africa is a constitutional democracy, and that is a very important statement. It's important that we understand what a constitutional democracy is. Unfortunately, our former president, Jacob Zuma, did not understand so well what a constitutional democracy was. He was a very much more traditionalist in the way he viewed the constitution, and the way in which he viewed power was a very much more traditional view of power. And he ended up butting heads with the Constitution much more than I think the founders of the Constitution itself anticipated. The president is described in the Constitution as the first citizen, and he is charged when he takes his oath of office with protecting and defending the Constitution. Unfortunately, because of his conduct and because of some of the choices that were challenged by other people in court, our former president discovered that even the president's powers are limited in a constitutional democracy. But this is a very fundamental and important point, is that there in a constitutional democracy is no person who is having absolute power. And so power is spread out into different places. So those political parties who are after power, if you elect them into the parliament, then they get power, but they do not get absolute power, and that was by design. This is the point of a constitutional democracy. So there are 3 areas of government that I wanted to talk to you about, which it's very important to understand how they're organized. The first one, that's a bit small, sorry about this, I shouldn't have written the slides quite that small, but the first slide is the political arm of government. Okay, so that's the arm that we're talking about in the elections here. So you elect the political arm of government. What happens is we, the voters, cast our votes and we elect a National Assembly. The National Assembly, at their first sitting, will elect the Speaker of Parliament and the President of the country. And the President of the party is then entitled to appoint his cabinet. And the cabinet is the ministers of the various departments. So we'll make Pete the Minister of Finance, and Beth the Minister of Social Development, and Ian the Minister of Religious and Traditional Affairs. So we've already got a pretty good looking cabinet going on here tonight. But if I was the president, I have carte blanche to choose whoever I want as my cabinet. And those ministers then go and run the various departments at the president's behest. That is the most significant power that the president has, is to choose who runs the different ministries. But all of us, the president included, were appointed through Parliament. And that means that all of us, including the president, are required to return to Parliament on a regular basis and to report to Parliament and to explain the performance that they have been sort of putting up. The president has to come back to Parliament on regular occasions and say, here are the plans that we're putting in place, and to take questions from Parliament itself. And this is the way in which the system creates checks and balances. So the president has a lot of power to appoint the cabinet, but even the cabinet ministers have to go back to Parliament and to account. And that's required by law. They have to do that. And I think that, it's important to recognize how that limits the powers that we think of a president having. And the other key area in the political arm of government is the Constitutional Court. This is the part of the government that checks whether or not the legislation passed by the National Assembly is constitutional. So it sounded like, the way I was describing, that the National Assembly actually has a huge amount of power to summon the president and demand accounting from the president. So they can also pass laws, so therefore the National Assembly must be the most powerful institution, right? But the Constitutional Court is a check on the powers of the National Assembly, in that any laws that are passed by the National Assembly are in fact, must be constitutional according to the laws of the Constitution. So the Constitutional Court will check, are the laws that the National Assembly passing constitutional? So even within the political arm of government, there are checks and balances, but there are even more checks and balances to government. And if you're ever wondering why it takes government so long to do anything, you're about to find out the answer, okay? The second arm of government that I want to talk about is the civil arm, or the civil service. Now, these are people who are employees of the state. These are not people who are elected or appointed by a president or some other way selected. These are people who have a contract of employment with the South African government. And these are the people that typically we think of as the government when we go to Home Affairs to get our ID book, or when we encounter someone maybe at the airport stamping our passports as we leave, or in a number of other areas, our police, our state doctors and nurses, the people who repair leaks on the roads, or provide the other services. These are all employees of the state. If you are an employee of any company in South Africa, you have rights, including labor rights and the rights of any employee, which means that it's not possible for me to fire you arbitrarily. I can't just fire you and get rid of you. So if I were to have a political party that was successful and I come in 2024 and I successfully form a government, I will inherit the civil service. And I might look at the civil service and say, there's a lot of useless people here. Fire them all. You can't do that because there are laws about how you dismiss someone. Pete knows very well how difficult it is sometimes when you have to deal with terminations. It's a really tricky and very protracted legal process. And so you actually have the civil service, which acts as almost like an institutional memory between governments. You have to remember that in 1994, when the ANC government came into power, they inherited a civil service of white, predominantly Afrikaans-speaking civil servants. They could not, as the ANC, come in and fire them all. And it was very difficult for the ANC in those early years, and there's a lot written about this, that they didn't trust the civil service that was supposedly working for the political arm of government. And so this acts also as a check on the powers of the political arm of government. Now, I'm not saying the civil arm of government is useless. The vast majority of those people are actually honest, hardworking people who are just trying to get on with their day-to-day jobs. It's a job for them like the rest of us. It's just, let's get on with our job and do our work and then go home and get our paycheck. That's what they want. And we often discount how much of what's actually going on in the civil service goes on in spite of the political class rather than because of the political class. The civil service doesn't typically benefit to the same degree from corruption that the political class does. So corruption is much more likely to occur amongst the political class. They do, however, need the assistance of key people in the civil service. And so there are key positions which often get targeted by politicians. And if we can get our guy to be the MEC of Finance, or if we can get our guy to be the person who signs off on the tenders, then we are good. And then we can really profit from corruption. But the vast majority of civil servants are actually just getting on with their jobs in whichever department they're getting on with. And then thirdly, we have these very cool institutions called the Chapter 9 institutions. Chapter 9 of the Constitution creates all of these institutions and gives them special powers in relation to the political and the civil service in government. So some of those are the South African Human Rights Commission, the Public Protector, and the most famous public protector we've had is Thuli Madonsela, who actually ended up sort of butting heads with former President Jacob Zuma, and ultimately her powers to even instruct the president of the country were confirmed. So we know that the Chapter 9 institutions are serious business. The South African Human Rights Commission has got wide-ranging powers to investigate and recommend what to do in the event of any human rights abuse of any South African individual. So any person who violates human rights, the SAHRC is empowered to investigate. And their recommendations are not voluntary. They can't be ignored. We know that after Jacob Zuma versus Thuli Madonsela. So the recommendations of all of these structures of government are actually not to be ignored. And this is another way in which there are checks and balances, and power is distributed and divided among all of these people. So all of these institutions are meant to serve us, the citizens of South Africa, and to protect us in some way or the other. What's the point? Why did I talk about the structure of government as my third point there? Well, hopefully because I wanted to leave you with this thought. Nothing is ever as good as it seems, but also nothing is ever as bad as it seems. Nothing has been broken that can't be rebuilt, and nothing that has been built cannot be broken. Democracy is always and will always be a work in progress. Every single time we go to vote, every single time our democracy renews itself and refreshes itself, we are trying to build, but we might also break. And so each and every time we vote, it's a very important thing. But also, if we break it, we get another chance to rebuild it. It's never something that is finished. A lot of us might like for democracy to reach an end state, and we've reached perfect democracy, and that's it. We can all rest now. But the reality is that that's not what democracy is. It's why it's so important for as many people who can to go and vote. And so I hope all of you have got that message. Do please all make the effort to go and vote. I hope you're all registered. It's very important for us to understand that the promises that we hear from political parties, they may be full of hot air, but just because they're lying to us or just because they are misleading us or overpromising, it's still not a good reason not to be involved in the democratic process. And I've got to say that there's been a lot of negativity, and a lot of people who I've been speaking to in the last few weeks have been talking really negatively. People are tired. It's been a tough period of time. And the government is largely responsible for having made that tough on us. South Africa has shot itself in the foot in many areas where it didn't need to over the past 15 years. There's no questioning that. And so our lives have gotten tougher. They've gotten more expensive. There have been many things that have been hard. And so I understand why people are tired and fed up and considering if they have the option, immigrating. Lots of people ask me, should I immigrate? Is it a good idea? They all want to know my views on this. What I say to them now, and I say to them genuinely, I always try and be honest with what I think. And for a while, it's been hard for me to make the case. But as we sit here right now, I'm genuinely hopeful and genuinely encouraged that we are turning the corner in some important areas, and that it doesn't matter what the final result of this election is, we are not going to be there yet. No matter what. It doesn't matter any of the outcomes of this election, we will not be there yet. But I believe that we have turned the corner and we are starting to build again rather than break, after a period of time where we've been breaking for allowing things to break almost, rather than breaking them ourselves. So I do have hope. And I want to leave us with that message that whatever happens on Wednesday, whatever happens in the aftermath, it could be a bumpy ride. Nothing is guaranteed in any election ever. But I do think that come what may, South Africa, all of those different pieces of the government, as well as the wider society, I think we're heading in the right direction again after a long period of wandering in the wilderness. So let me leave you with that. Thanks, Ian.
Cool. Thank you very much, Grant. Incredibly informative. And so we're going to just take some questions. So might want to just keep that on for now. So we'll take any questions that there might be. What I'll do it similar to what we did last time. I'll just bring you the mic, and you can ask a question if there is a question. And then we will spend time praying together for the elections, for South Africa, and for hope. That hope that you have shared with us as well, that there would be hope in people turning to God and saying, God, you're in control, and we believe that it's your kingdom, and we trust in you. And so there is hope, even when there is negativity on the news or wherever it might come from. Let's see. Does anyone have a question that they want to ask? Cool.
Hi. Hope you don't mind. I'm going to refer to the last talk because I was sitting at home wanting to ask and I didn't. A statement you made the last time was that coalitions work. And you also said that it doesn't really matter if you vote for a smaller party. Is that experience you've had in your African travels, or because personally I haven't seen any coalitions work in South Africa?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for the question. Let me try and emphasize what I was trying to say. And if I didn't say it perfectly clearly, then let me try again to be clear. The process of becoming a country in which coalition governments are a feature is a sign of a maturing democracy. And that was my point. So initially, most democracies look like the one that we have had for 30 years. And you have to remember that in time frame scales, our democracy of 30 years, we are a baby. We are barely out of our nappies as a democracy. We are working out so many things that in time will become easier because we've gone through them before. The oldest democracy is the American democracy, and it's about 250 years old. So relative to America's democracy, and even they continue to struggle in meaningful ways, we're a very, very young democracy. But if you look globally, to answer the question, am I talking just in Africa? No, I'm talking about research globally. If you look at the number of governments in just Western Europe that are actually formations of coalitions, there are a large number of governments in Western Europe that require coalitions of different political parties to form a government. And I referenced Belgium, which had such a tough time forming a coalition that it took over 500 days before they could actually constitute their government. So it's not just an African feature. There are a lot of coalitions in Africa. There are a lot of coalitions in Western Europe. There are a lot of coalitions in Southeast Asia. And you refer to coalitions at the municipal level in South Africa. And here I will concede that many of those have not covered themselves in glory, particularly the more recent ones. No one here is arguing that some of these coalitions have been serving the interests of the voters. And, we sit here in Johannesburg with a mayor whose party won 1 seat in the legislature, which is an absurdity. That is the kind of unusual thing that rarely happens in other democracies. So there are features of what's happening in our municipal coalitions that everyone should justifiably be upset with. And I'm not giving coalitions a blank check and saying they're always good. No, each coalition has to be judged on its merits. What I was trying to say at the time was there has been a lot of fear-mongering. We don't want coalitions because look at what's happened in the municipalities. And my point was we are, if you flipped a coin, more likely than not going to get a coalition. So we have to make the best of it. And my point there was, just because we will likely end up in a coalition government after the 29th of May does not mean that the country is destined to be set on fire, right? And there are several configurations of the coalition which big business is very excited about, which international investors are very excited about. The one that most people get excited about outside of South Africa is the idea of an ANC-DA coalition. This fantastical idea that the ANC has the popular support to get policies passed, and the DA brings some sort of intellectual, maybe free market understanding to our policies. I think that particular coalition is a little bit of fantasy thinking myself personally. I'm not terribly convinced that things would work out that way if that were to be the case. But my point is that there are some formulations of the coalitions, and we don't know which type of coalition we'll end up with, that actually are exciting people. They are excited for that kind of a coalition. So it doesn't mean that a coalition must follow the Joburg experience or must follow the Ekurhuleni experience or the Pretoria experience. And there has been an example of a very successful coalition, and we forget this was the first coalition that occurred in our democratic dispensation. That was the coalition for the city of Cape Town. And that led to ultimately a very, very successful period for the Democratic Alliance. But initially, that was a coalition of the Democratic Party, as well as several other smaller parties, which then fused to form the Democratic Alliance later. And the people of Cape Town benefited from that coalition. So there's an example, even in South Africa, that coalitions can work. And it really does depend on who the partners are and what the dynamics are. That was my point.
Okay, sorry. Just one more. So you said that last time, it doesn't really matter if you vote for a smaller party. And then the DA did form a...
Moonshot Pact.
Yeah, you
Yes.
got it. And some parties didn't join that because they didn't like attitude of the DA was a bit bullying, and they felt that they would take over if they joined. So some of those smaller parties didn't join. What happens if you vote for one of those parties that didn't join that DA gathering? Is it all you're voting for is that person to go to Parliament? And do they then form the coalition after they go to Parliament, or is it still worth voting for one of those parties?
Well, I mean, it's a very practically oriented question, because you are asking what is the consequence of my vote, which is, I think, the most important question anyone can ask. So if you vote for a party that is described as a smaller party, let's remember that we don't know the results until after the elections. So we may presume to know that the ANC will get close to 50%, but nothing is guaranteed. There's no way to know until after the elections what the ANC gets. So right now we're assuming the ANC gets between 45 and 50% based on polls. But polls have been shown in the past to be wildly inaccurate. So you just don't know what's going to happen at any stage. So no party knows what seats they're going to get until the results are finalized. Okay, now the picture does emerge over the course of several days. So we do start to see the picture emerging slowly, so that the final results are not a huge surprise, because they've been creeping up on us gradually. But, you know, if you want to describe a party as a smaller party, realistically, most of the parties that are not the DA, EFF, or the ANC are going to get under 5% of the vote. I think that's a very reasonable expectation, but we don't know. People are talking about the MK party possibly getting 10% of the vote. That would be an astonishing performance for a party that didn't exist a year ago. Okay, so if that happened, it would really shake up our politics, you know, and then it would cause all sorts of different realignments. Because at the end of the day, what I explained last time is that our president gets elected by the parliament, and so ultimately you need to get enough of the seats in parliament to vote for your presidential candidate to elect them as president. And therefore, if you're voting for a small party that hasn't said we'll be part of the Moonshot Pact, that party might, at the end of the day, be swayed in post-election negotiations to enter the Moonshot Pact, or the ANC may approach them and say, you got 4%, we're sitting on 47%, let's merge and let's vote together. And I think that the last thing we can learn from coalitions at the municipal level is that even if you have an agreement today, that doesn't mean anything about 6 months' time. Those coalition agreements can collapse. when there's unhappiness on one or the other partner's side? So it's a very hard question to answer. What I was trying to counteract is that there has definitely been a strategy of fear-mongering, particularly on the part of the DA, to persuade voters, don't vote for a smaller party, you're wasting your vote, and also you are simply rewarding the ANC by doing so. Vote for us to secure, and there's their messaging, there's their campaign messaging. You see, so first the fear, then the promise. It's a very powerful cocktail. It works very well for voters. And my point was to try and encourage you, if you like the policies of a smaller party, vote for it. That's your democratic right. You do not have to vote out of fear. You should vote for the party that you identify with and that you believe will actually take you forward. I use that example of the bus. Climb on the bus, that takes you where you think you're going to go. That's my advice. If that's the DA, vote for the DA because you like their policies. But don't vote for the DA and not the party you want to vote for out of fear. That was my primary point.
Hi. Could you tell me, are there any parties that you know of that have got people in the parties that are, I don't know how else to say it, maybe agents of the World Economic Forum?
Of the World Economic Forum.
And I'm not kidding, because we've got half the cabinet in Canada who are World Economic Forum. Biden, clearly Economic Forum, because Klaus Schwab was boasting it. He's his favorite disciple, if you want to call him that. And then you've got Holland, which has got this problem. So, you know, when I'm voting, I want to make a decision and I want to know that these people are not influencing a party in any way. So there are people in South Africa, I mean, they're all around the world, even in China. I mean, they're around. And I don't want to be I don't want to have my vote. I don't want to have my vote being party to them.
Okay.
So that's my objective, is to find, are there any parties who have these people inside?
All right. I mean, it's a very, very interesting question. Again, thank you for that. Let me start just to catch everyone up. What is the World Economic Forum? This is a group of very wealthy individuals and very powerfully connected individuals who every year gather in Davos in Switzerland, and they talk about the state of the global economy. It is a talk shop. It is a bunch of people gathering to listen to seminars, to network, and to basically plan how they're going to make their money in the year heading forward. That's what it is. But of course, that much money and that much power residing in one place does lead to sort of, you know, things emanating from the World Economic Forum that sometimes shape our global policies or shape global economies or shape global events. During COVID, for example, there was a lot that was influenced by the thinking expressed at the World Economic Forum when they met in their annual meetings about how to deal with the pandemic. And I think that caused a lot of people some real discomfort. So, say again? There you go, yes. So the World Economic Forum, in essence, it's a talk shop of the very wealthy and the very powerful. And if I can talk maybe to the underlying suspicion that you have, is that you don't want to vote for people who are advancing the causes of the very wealthy and the very powerful. Yes. So if that's your goal, I think then you are most likely interested in the parties, here I have to use some political terminology, that are more towards the left. Parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters, or parties like the ANC, they're typically center-left. There are other smaller parties that also have left sort of policies. But if you are sort of concerned about the influence of money in politics and of the powerful in our governments, then you want to look to the left, because ideologically they oppose capital and they oppose wealth and power. So those are the parties that you want to consider as your first call. That would be where I'd start. A party like the DA is the opposite of that. The DA is almost certainly going to align themselves with very much the policies that, the WDF doesn't make policies, but the kind of thinking that is permeating something like the World Economic Forum.
I want to just make a comment and then see, Grant, if you're prepared to give your opinion. I am hugely encouraged by what I see, and I'm probably a little bit idealistic about it, but I am greatly encouraged by what I see of the new smaller parties. I've got a bit disillusioned with the parties we've seen and the big parties. And what I see in the newer parties are younger people, fresh faces, carefully thought out policies, values that I can support. And I'm sad that I don't think, if I hadn't been reading and choosing my articles to read, I wouldn't know about these parties. And I'm enormously sad that more people in South Africa don't know. We've got a whole lot more options than we think. And we've got a whole lot more hopeful options. And let me say, honestly, what I think. I want to support younger people because younger people are going to take this country forward, I think, and give my grandchildren and hopefully great-grandchildren a positive future in what is a wonderful country to be in. And I just wonder how on earth we can encourage people to look much more widely than we have been looking for the past number of years. Do you think people are doing that in this country? Do you think young professional people in this country are doing that, older than 30, those who are going to vote? And am I right to be hopeful about those parties in terms of what you know of some of the people there?
Yes, it's a lovely comment, and I think you've expressed an optimism that I think there is some justification for some optimism. And when I was looking at a number of the newer parties, they really do have very professional and very well thought out policies. The Rise Mzansi manifesto was birthed in a very, very sort of inclusive way. The Rivonia Circle, an NGO that Songezo Zibi was leading at the time, were going around the country, and they were having these Imbizos meetings in all parts of the country, and they were talking about the aspirations predominantly of the voiceless, of the young people, of the economically excluded, of people in rural areas who just don't have access to the opportunities we have in urban areas. And they birthed their manifesto from those Imbizos, all of these Imbizos that came around the country. So in some way, Rise Mzansi is the response. It's the political vehicle that they are offering those people who expressed their hope for a better future. And that's why their policies are so fully fleshed out and they look very attractive. Build One South Africa. It emanates from it's not a centralized political party. It's a very decentralized group of independents who know their communities. These are people who work in a very active way. Someone like Beth is an activist in her community because she does so much social concern work, and there are people who know their communities, the DNA of their communities, down to the last brick on the streets, and those people are part of Build One South Africa's network. And they feed what they know of their communities and their needs back into the Build One South Africa manifesto. So there's some fantastic manifestos in the so-called smaller parties. And that's why I don't resonate with this fear-mongering, particularly the DA says, you must vote for us because anything else is one, a wasted vote, and two, you're just going to be handing power back to the ANC. Factually, neither of those things are true. The hope that you're expressing, we can't know. There's no way to know. But what I can say is that the Democratic Alliance is currently the official opposition, sitting at 20%. It's had a massive impact on our politics for the past 30 years. In 1994, you remember what the percentage of the DP's vote was in the national elections? Does anyone remember? It was 2%. The DP was 2% of the vote in 1994. It's 10 times that today. So a small party one day is the official opposition the next. Or in the case of Zambia, the opposition is the ruling party the next. Politics is unpredictable. That's why I said we don't know what the results are until the 29th, because as voters, we decide. That's the principle, we decide. And if a significant number of voters rise up and vote in a particular way, then the results will reflect that. So, feeling despondent because you are prejudging the notion that you're voting for a party that's not going to get any traction, you must vote, hopefully. You must vote with sort of that optimism that you're expressing. And surprising things happen all the time. So the comment, yeah, just for the mic, and maybe vote for a longer term view. That's what you said. Yeah, and I would agree with that. Yeah, 100%. You don't just need to be thinking about this election. Yeah. Just one point to think about. If you want to think about the opposite of our system, a multi-party system where you have 90 options on the ballot paper, which can feel very overwhelming, think about the American system. In America, when you go to the ballot, your choice is Democrat or Republican. The Democratic policies, there are some of those policies you like, there are some you really hate. And you look on the other side, the Republicans have some policies you really like and some you really hate. But it's this or that, and you have to take all of this or you have to take all of that. That's a rough choice. And I think a lot of Americans express frustration that there's never been an effective third option in American politics. We don't have that here. We have multiple options, and we should celebrate that. We don't want our elections to end up being ANC versus DA all the way into the future. That is not the way in which South Africa goes forward. That is a way in which we stagnate, and we shout at one another across the aisle. So having a multi-party democracy is something to celebrate, not to fear. I hope that point comes through clearly. Because I don't want to feel like I was saying coalitions are great and we should vote for whoever, but I don't like that sort of spirit of fear, don't vote for smaller parties. I really don't support that idea.
This is somewhat different, but the last couple of weeks I've been listening to a few people on radio and stuff, and a lot of times I'm hearing a lot of gender-based violence that people are talking about, but I'm not clear on what this actually means. Is it clear-cut? Are they talking about violence against women by men, or are they talking about people that are non-binary kind of scenario? I'm not clear on if there's a distinction.
Yeah. I can't speak for every circumstance that you've heard there, because there is some confusion as to when you use that term, what it refers to necessarily. Gender-based violence, as a rule, refers to any act of violence that occurs because of the gender of the person who the violence is being perpetrated against. So it does, in some instances, as a definition, include people who are identifying as non-binary, transgender people, and other persons who are what we call non-conforming genders. So it's an interesting place to have this discussion in the church, but nonetheless, the focus on sort of gender violence, I think, is a response to what is a very serious issue in South Africa, which is the amount of violence that women experience at the hands of men. And in the vast majority of cases, it's often an intimate partner or a family member. Someone who they ought to be looking to for protection, but in the end ends up abusing them and perpetrating violence. It is a scourge in South Africa, and it is a black mark on our consciences, really. It's really not a great thing for us as South Africans to have to live with day to day. But it's one of the issues that does get brought up as something that parties want to deal with. And whichever party or parties come into power in government, I think all of us, irrespective of who we voted for, want them to deal with issues like this and make some improvements and strides there. Yeah. Looks like we're good.
All right. Great. Well, thank you, Grant. So you can mute there, and thank you to everyone who has come and who engaged and been attentive and given consideration to what has been shared, and then in the way that you will go forward from here. What I'd like us to do is to spend some time to pray together now for these elections, but also the comment made that for the longer term, to pray about what will happen after these elections and those who will be in the leadership, and to pray for those who are considering whether to vote or not. And so the way I'd like to do that is to here. We won't be mic'd up. Those who may watch us later online will have an opportunity to pray wherever they are. But just as you feel led to offer prayers, and then what I'll do is I'll close in the end for us together using some of the expressions that came from our 10 days of prayer between Ascension Day and Pentecost, and what some people wrote down about praying for the elections and South Africa. So yeah, I'm going to sit down here in front as well, and just as you feel led to pray what is in your heart as we express our desires to God for this time.